This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you sent over some notes on Canada in the 1930s, and wow, it looks like they were walking a tightrope with everything going on in Europe.
Yeah, you could say that it was a really interesting time for Canada. Europe's getting closer and closer to war, and they're trying to figure out how to respond, how to deal with their own issues, and really trying to define their place, on the world stage.
Okay, so let's dive into this. We're working with a lecture called Canada's Reaction to European Crises in the 1930s by Mr. Hutchings. Sounds like we've got some serious history to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. Mr. Hutchings goes really deep into how Canada dealt with things like the Abyssinian invasion, the Spanish Civil War, and Hitler moving into the Rhineland. These were huge tests for Canada, as a young nation.
So for this deep dive, the big question is, how did Canada, with all its internal divisions, navigate these massive events? And what can we learn from the choices they made?
Right.
Let's set the scene a little bit. What was going on within Canada at the time? I know there was a big divide between French and English Canadians.
Yeah, that's right. To understand what Canada did, you really have to understand this internal struggle that was happening. So you've got French Canadians. A lot of them felt that these European conflicts weren't their problem. They preferred isolationism, basically staying out of it completely.
Okay.
Then you have English Canadians, many with strong ties to Britain, and they felt like they had a duty to support Britain if war broke out.
So it's almost like Canada had two completely different perspectives on how to approach the world.
Yeah, exactly. And that created a real challenge for Prime Minister Mackenzie-King. Imagine having to balance those competing views while the world around you is basically falling apart. He had to find a way to unite a divided nation and at the same time deal with these growing international crises.
Okay, so with all this internal tension as a backdrop, let's talk about the first crisis on the list, Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. Pretty bold move by Mussolini, don't you think? What was his game?
Well, it seemed like it was all about expanding Italy's empire in Africa. Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, was a valuable target. But this invasion, it was more than just land grabbing. It was a direct challenge to the League of Nations, which was pretty new at the time, and this whole idea of collective security, this concept that countries would work together to prevent war and aggression.
And Canada was a member of the League of Nations, right? So how did they react to this, knowing they were kind of expected to uphold this idea of collective security?
Canada's response was, well, it was cautious. They condemned the invasion, but they hesitated when it came to actually enforcing sanctions against Italy. Remember, Mackenzie-King was trying to walk a tightrope at home. He was really worried about escalating the conflict and dividing the nation even more, especially since they were already split on this whole issue of getting involved in Europe.
So it sounds like they were trying to support the League of Nations without, causing too much trouble.
Exactly. But this hesitancy, and other countries responded in similar ways, contributed to the League's failure to stop Mussolini. It was a huge blow to this idea of collective security, and it would have serious consequences down the road.
So even though Canada wasn't directly involved, their actions, or I guess you could say inaction, had a big impact on what happened?
Absolutely. And this reluctance to really step in would become a recurring theme in how Canada responded to the other crises happening in Europe. In fact, the Spanish Civil War, which started just a year later, would really highlight this divide within Canada.
Okay, before we get into the Spanish Civil War, let's talk a bit more about isolationism, which was a major factor in Canada's approach. It wasn't just about staying out of European wars, right? It was a bigger idea about Canada's place in the world.
You're right. It's important to understand what isolationism really meant. For a lot of French Canadians, it was about being culturally and linguistically distinct. They saw themselves as separate from Britain and all those European power struggles. For others, it was more about avoiding war, the economic costs and the human costs. They were still thinking about World War I, and they wanted to protect Canada from more suffering.
So it was a mix of cultural identity, historical memory, and also, just being practical.
Exactly. And this made it even more challenging for Mackenzie-King to find a unified approach to these crises in Europe. It's like he was trying to reconcile two completely different ideas of what it meant to be Canadian.
Okay, I'm starting to see how much this internal struggle really influenced Canada's foreign policy. So with that in mind, let's move on to the Spanish Civil War, which started in 1936. This one feels even more ideologically charged, fascists against democratic forces.
Yeah, as a key moment in the fight against fascism.
Mm-hmm.
And for Canada, it really exposed the deep divisions that we've been talking about.
Sounds like things are about to get even more complicated for Mackenzie King and for Canada as a whole.
The Spanish Civil War, I mean, it was brutal. And in a way, it became a proxy war for this bigger ideological struggle between fascism and democracy that was happening all over Europe.
And for Canada, this wasn't just some far-off conflict, right? The ideological battle lines of the Spanish Civil War, they were mirrored in Canada, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. It really exposed those fault lines that we've been talking about. English Canadians were generally more sympathetic to the Republicans, the side fighting against fascism. A lot of them saw it as a fight for democracy itself. On the other hand, many French Canadians, influenced by the Catholic Church, were more inclined to support Franco's nationalists, who were more traditional, more authoritarian.
So even though Canada was officially neutral, the war was playing out in the hearts and minds of Canadians.
Yeah, you could say that. And what's really interesting is that it wasn't just a passive debate. Some Canadians were so passionate about fighting fascism that they took matters into their own hands.
You're talking about the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion, right? Canadians who actually volunteered to go fight in Spain.
Exactly. Even though the government was officially staying out of it, around 1,700 Canadians, mostly men, joined the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion and fought with the Republicans. They were driven by a really strong sense of idealism, this belief that they had to fight against fascism.
Wow, it's incredible to think about those people risking their lives for a cause they believed in, even though their own government wasn't involved. Really shows you the power of personal conviction.
It does. And it also highlights the fact that a country's response to a crisis can be much more complex than just looking at official government policy. You have to consider what individuals are doing and what motivates them.
So we have this backdrop of internal division, Canada trying to stay neutral, and then this group of citizens who are so committed to fighting fascism that they travel across the world to join the fight. What a complicated picture.
And complicated, for sure. But it tells you a lot about Canada's identity at the time. They were trying to find their place in the world, caught between this desire for peace and a growing awareness of the threats to democracy.
It's like Canada was trying to have it both ways, staying out of the conflict officially, but also making a statement about their values through the actions of the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion.
I think you're right. And this tension between staying out of European affairs and feeling like they had a responsibility to defend democracy would become even more obvious as things continued to unfold in Europe.
And speaking of which, 1936 was also the year that Hitler made his move, marched his troops right into the Rhineland, breaking the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, what a bold move. How did the major powers like Britain and France, how did they respond?
Their response was, well, it was surprisingly muted. I mean, they condemned it, but they didn't do anything.
Nothing. They just let Hitler walk in and take over the Rhineland.
They really didn't want to get into another war. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and they hoped that appeasement might prevent another conflict.
And Canada, what about them? How did they react to Hitler basically ignoring the treaty and to Britain and France doing nothing?
Canada followed suit. They decided to stay neutral, even though Germany was becoming more and more aggressive.
So it seems like they were, again, trying to avoid getting mixed up in these European conflicts, even though things were getting really serious.
Yeah, and there are a couple of ways to interpret this. Historians like Robert Bothwell and J.L. Granatstein have argued that this was Canada showing its independence. They didn't want to automatically follow Britain into war. They were starting to be more assertive.
So this was maybe a sign of Canada becoming its own player on the world stage, making their own decisions.
Exactly. But it also shows the limits of Canada's influence at the time. They weren't a major player in international affairs, and they knew it.
So they were walking a fine line, trying to be independent, but also recognizing that they couldn't do everything.
That's it. And as you might imagine, this approach of staying neutral would have some big consequences as things in Europe kept escalating.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our main question. We've seen how Canada responded to these three major crises: the invasion of Abyssinia, the Spanish Civil War, and Hitler moving into the Rhineland. And it seems like the common thread is this struggle between wanting to stay out of it and knowing that their actions or inactions could have serious consequences.
You're right. And that leads to a really important question. What were the consequences of trying to balance these two things?
Yeah.
How did those decisions affect Canada's future, both at home and in the world?
Okay, so let's shift gears a little and talk about the impact of all this. Did the choices that Canada made in the 1930s, Did they help or hurt them in the long run?
Yeah, it really makes you think how these events happening so far away could have such a big impact on Canada.
Yeah. In the short term, though, Canada's neutrality, I mean, it did keep them out of war in the 1930s. And that was really important to Mackenzie King, right? He knew a lot of Canadians didn't want to get involved in another European conflict.
Right, so in a way, you could say their policy worked. They
Yeah.
stayed out of war while everyone else was on the edge of it.
True. But the question is, what did it cost them? Their reluctance to really get involved, to stand up to aggression, maybe it actually made a world war more likely.
You could say that. It's like they were using a garden hose to put out a forest fire.
Exactly.
The League of Nations, with Canada as a member, they could have been that fire truck. But without everyone being on the same page about taking action, it failed to stop leaders like Mussolini and Hitler. And that failure, well, made war more likely.
It's like sometimes trying to stay neutral can actually make things worse. You know, by not taking a stand, you might end up facing an even bigger problem later on.
Right. And this brings us to some important takeaways for you, the listener. I think one of the biggest lessons we can learn from Canada is that neutrality is a really tricky thing. It's not always as simple as just staying out of it. Sometimes doing nothing can have just as many consequences as doing something.
Like they say, all it takes for evil to win is for good people to do nothing.
That's it. And another important takeaway is that even in a democracy, people are going to have different opinions. Look at Canada in the 1930s. You had French Canadians who wanted to stay out of it, English Canadians who felt closer to Britain, and then those individuals who went to fight in Spain, even though their own government didn't. It's really hard to find a unified voice, especially when the stakes are so high.
Yeah, it makes you realize that being a leader in times of crisis isn't just about making decisions. It's about dealing with all those different opinions and all the pressure from the outside world. It must have been tough for Mackenzie King trying to keep everyone happy.
He had a tough job, for sure. But studying how leaders like Mackenzie King dealt with those challenges can teach us a lot about how countries should or maybe shouldn't approach similar situations today.
It also shows you how connected the world really is. Even though Canada was far away from Europe, what was happening over there affected them deeply and ultimately shaped their future.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's even more true today with globalization. Everything's connected. So we need to pay attention to what's happening around the world, even if it seems far away, because it could affect us too.
And we need to think about how we can contribute to making the world a better place. Even though Canada's government was officially neutral, we saw Canadians who stood up for what they believed in, like those who joined the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. It reminds us that we can all make a difference.
You're right. Sometimes those individual actions can have a much bigger impact than you might think. They can inspire other people, challenge the way things are, and really contribute to positive change.
Makes you wonder what might have happened if more people had spoken out against fascism back then, or if more countries had stood up to aggression early on. Maybe things would have turned out differently.
We'll never know for sure. But that's what's so great about history. It makes us think critically about the past, consider different points of view, and imagine what could have been.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said about Canada's evolving identity. It seems like the 1930s weren't just a test of their foreign policy, but also a test of who they were as a country. How did these crises shape how they saw themselves?
That's a great question. It was a time of a lot of internal division for Canada, but it was also a time when they started to become more independent from Britain. It was like they were growing up.
So it was a time of struggle both within the country and with the outside world. And it forced them to ask some really big questions about who they were and what their place in the world was.
Exactly. And I think it prepared them for the more active role they would play in the world after World War II.
Yeah.
They came out of the war with a stronger sense of themselves and a greater willingness to engage with the world, not just follow along. You can say that those tough choices they made in the 1930s, even the mistakes, helped to shape Canada into the country it is today.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of boring facts and dates. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it's still shaping our world. And even though we can't change what happened, we can learn from it. We can use it to understand what's happening now and make better choices for the future.
I like that. This has been a really interesting deep dive. There's so much to think about.
It has. Thanks for joining us. And a big thanks to you, our listener, for sending us these sources and giving us a chance to explore this part of history. We've learned a lot about Canada's balancing act in the 1930s, their internal struggles, their careful approach to foreign policy, and how global events had a big impact on them.
Yeah, it's a story that teaches us about leadership, the challenges of neutrality, how connected the world is, and the power of individual action. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make today and the kind of world we want to create for tomorrow.
That's to think about, right? Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.